Welcome to the Thinkers and Doers podcast, where we hear from the leading thinkers and doers shaping the world around us. I am your host, Luke Graham, and today I have the privilege of speaking with Simon Kuestenmacher, a German demographer based out of Melbourne, Australia. Simon and I have a few conversations during this hour, including the mental health crisis emerging out of people overly trying to find purpose in their work, as well as demographic challenges around the use of space and design of our cities, most notably aging populations, loneliness, and what this means for the way that we use spaces. I hope you enjoy. Simon Kuestenmacher, lovely to have you. Thank you for joining me. You are a demographer. Tell me, what does that entail? What is the demographics group and what led you into this world?
Well, yeah, as a demographer, all I do every day, all day long, is look at big picture population data and lots of other big picture data sets to understand how the world works, how different industries work, and how the future might be different from the present, simply because demographics is essentially the closest thing we have to a crystal ball, because in quite a few countries around the world, forecasting the population is an outrageously precise act, largely migration nations. Like I'm operating in Australia, and we dictate how many people we let into the country every year, and we know very much how many babies we're going to make every year, how many of us will not make it to the next year. So we'll be spot on there, and then we can see the ups and downs of human populations. We see what phase of the life cycle we'll see a big surge of population, where we'll see a bit of a slump. So that is largely the study of demographics, and then applying this type of knowledge with additional knowledge on any kind of issue that might be of interest. My organization is called the Demographics Group, and we do that. So we are largely a speaking business. So we got essentially by now 3 speakers on demographics, and we travel the country, the globe, to chat about demographics. And we also do specialized demographic consulting to government, to business. And that's not a career that young kids dream of, to be honest. So
I did.
I want more kids like you then. It's something that you stumble into. My journey into demographics was very much an accident. I had no idea what to do with my life after high school. So I just studied geography at university because I thought it was interesting. And I figured that'll do for now. And after uni, worked as a data analyst. Anybody can be a data analyst. And then slowly realized that you can do demographics for a living. And it blew me away that it is possible to just do the fun stuff, which I really appreciated. And I've been doing this in that form for a decade plus, and really enjoying thinking through things from the big picture perspective.
And I've been following your work for quite a few years now, because I was following your business partner since very early in my career,
Yeah.
even before my career. He's got quite a big reputation, Bernard Salt. The two of you, I believe, met in a prior world of yours. Is that right? And you kicked off together back in 2017 or something along those lines.
Yeah, so in 2017 we started the demographics group together. Before that, I started working for KPMG Demographics. That was headed by Bernard Salt, and yeah, I got that role back in the day again by pure accident, since I just saw that KPMG Demographics existed, and applied for a job that was advertised there. And Bernard interviewed me and said afterwards, "Why the hell are you applying for this job? This is a part admin role. Like, you're not an admin guy." I was like, "Ah, I don't care. I know. It's just I just want to do demographics. That's what I'm after." And he called me a day after and said, like, "I'm not getting that job, but I create another job for you." And so then I started working with Bernard there, and we took on a new shape after leaving KPMG.
You know what? That's a lovely little segue. That is something that I was obviously not aware of. But speaking of jobs being created, that is naturally the dream. That's generally what I try to do in my career as well. If I see a job description, come in and say, "Oh, look, this isn't quite exactly me, but if I tinker here and tinker there, and then things line up pretty well." So a lot of your work, a lot of your thought leadership, a lot of the speaking you do, a lot of the writing you do is around the future of work. Naturally, over the last, say, three and a half, 4 years, that's increased in prevalence. That conversation, it's become a more fierce conversation. We've touched on it in a few previous episodes on the thinkers and doers in the past from other experts. How have you seen that sort of future of work conversation transform over your time in demographics? How's it changed, people asking you around speaking gigs, writing gigs, all those sorts of things?
Well, I guess with young people, the obsession with work having to be meaningful has been increasing quite steadily over the last couple of decades. And I think this is not so much a generational phenomenon as a creeping change over time. And I would say it has to do with the meaning of life. The meaning in your life needs to come from somewhere. And bit by bit, religion doesn't fill that hole anymore because we, in many Western nations, increasingly become a bunch of atheists. So that falls away as a source of meaning. That wasn't a problem for the baby boomer generation, where we also had lots of atheists, but they at least started families very early. And so they would always have claimed that the meaning of life comes from family. And so we now find ourselves in a time of the life cycle in history where we start families in the mid to late 30s. That means for about 20 years after leaving high school, the meaning of life must come from somewhere. And that's why the millennials were labeled as a cohort that is obsessed with experiences, that shuns, that forgoes materialistic goods in order to experience the world, to travel, to do yoga, to go on festivals, and of course also to find meaning in work. And that is probably a problematic bit if you think about it. I'm quite critical about the obsession with meaningful work, particularly the narratives that all those TED Talks and the like push on you, that they don't say it just like that, but they very much imply that if your job doesn't provide meaning in your life, it is a failure. You're not doing the right job. You should position yourself in a job that provides meaning. I'm a numbers guy. I'm arguing that in a country like Australia, where we have 14 million jobs, how likely is it that we align 14 million jobs with 14 million individual passions and desires? It is an absolute unrealistic beauty ideal. I tend to call this work image issues. That is the office equivalent to body image issues, where we look at these sexy models and bodybuilders on Instagram, and then we look at ourselves and we go, could be better. And we literally have millions upon millions of young people on antidepressants.
Yeah.
All of those mental health surveys show that people, particularly young women, in their early 20s have insane rates of chronic mental health issues. That is because they can't win. It is an unrealistic sense of what your job should provide you with, particularly in your early years. If you think about this, straight out of uni, by definition, you are young and unexperienced. Even though you are the most idealistic that you will ever be in your life. That means you are desperate for your job to be spot on, to do the right thing, to change the world. But really, you'll start at the absolute bottom of the of the pyramid, bottom of the hierarchy. And if you want a meaningful job, which is by far not guaranteed that you will ever reach it, it is only something that you navigate into bit by bit throughout your career. Let's call it a decade that you need to navigate, proactively need to navigate yourself into this. Easier said than done. Let's say you finished your uni in your mid-20s. That means by your mid-30s, you have a fighting chance to be in a job that actually matches your passions and desires. Pretty difficult. Throw on top of this
Yeah.
a bit of a macroeconomic shift of things, and things get more complicated. So I don't want to be the big demographic party pooper here, but I want to create realistic expectations of what work can be. Yes, it is better to have a job that perfectly aligns with your passions, with your desires. Absolutely. But don't rely on it to make sure that you call your life a success.
I'm not sure if you're a big reader of Friedrich Nietzsche, are you?
Well, I'm German, so I did my fair bit of Nietzsche, yeah, in my
Yes.
youth. Absolutely.
I was going to say, I didn't want to draw that connection until you did, because I haven't read every Australian writer. Uh, but but although I have read Bernard Salt. But it's very interesting the point you make there around purpose and around generations and those sorts of things. You know, I believe I haven't read this of his, but I believe he's often cited as one of the philosophers who foresaw this, you know, death of God and and adjacent sort of death of meaning and the emergence of, you know, a lot of radical politics, which we then saw in the 20th century and now what we're seeing now, around, you know, this point that you've made around finding purpose in your work. And you know, when I see some of your work in this area, it reminds me of a quote that I remember coming across a little while ago that I try to remind myself of every now and then, when I indulge a lot on this side in my career, which is that you should never spoil a good hobby by getting paid for it, right?
Yeah. And there is something like this, and I've done the same in my personal sporting career in, if you will, playing futsal in Australia up to a level. I absolutely love it. It's a wonderful sport and pastime, but I played it up to a level where it was stressful, where it became not fun anymore, and I literally forced myself into not enjoying the sport anymore, which is a big shame, if you will. So you can do this by putting too much stress on it, by losing the joy of things. That's something that you need to be aware of. But of course, life goes through stages, and of course, you need hobbies, you need meaning in your life. This is something that we can say quite easily in an environment where we're not absolutely suffering from cost of living. Because if you think about what hobbies, for example, mean, it means that you have some sort of spare time to indulge in a pastime. Yeah, whether this is an exercise, gardening, carpentry, whatever it is, doesn't matter. Usually it requires a bit of time. If the cost of living is an absolute catastrophe, you need all the money that you can get. People work longer, they are more stressed, they just don't have the mental capacity, if they're constantly under stress, to do something like, let's say, gardening. Even though that might take stress off them, it's just too hard of a hurdle to do. So it is easier to have a bottle of wine and watch some Netflix. That is actually easier. It is not helping. It is probably making things worse. But that's, as a society, when you look at, it's very much a global phenomenon, that cost of living is rising. Housing, a basic core necessity of life, is in many nations becoming forbiddingly expensive. That creates stress. That eats away from the spare time. And so I always point to the UK, Australia, the US are prime examples of we need to fix housing first. So when I'm writing my weekly and my monthly columns about whatever it is in the world of demographics that I'm writing about, sooner or later, and it really annoys me, there's always a housing angle. Because it is such a cornerstone issue that we haven't fixed. It takes up so much finances, these finances that we throw into the property market, way and above beyond the whole idea that we need some sort of nice box to live in. Yes, this needs to be financed, but there is so much speculation in the market that creates empty calories. In terms of wealth creation, because what do I care if my house is $1 million or $1.5 million, whatever it is, doesn't matter. The box is the same, but the $500,000 with interest rates probably closer to $800,000 that I'm spending on the house rather than on something else, that is not productive. If I was to invest this wealth either in just consumption, it is more economically productive. If I'm investing it otherwise, let's say into the stock market, that is economically more productive because it creates new wealth, new businesses, new jobs. That is much more interesting than the empty calories of the housing market.
Yeah, so that's a really good argument, and I appreciate you making that because we did some research, what about 6 months or so ago around this concept of idiosyncratic risk as well, and now that's a academic term or a financial term that a lot of listeners won't automatically know the definition of. But essentially, the idea of idiosyncratic risk is that if your property is, say, as Simon's just said now, $1 million or £1 million, depending on what market you're in, and you're throwing every last cent you have into your home, then you are completely overexposed to the performance of that asset solely, like a loan. So if that asset performs poorly, you're in trouble. You've got no portfolio diversification as well. So yeah, it's a good argument.
And that's what high property markets do by definition. They force you to put not all of your eggs, but an awful lot of your eggs into a single basket. And you are exposed by definition. And any investment, and a house in that instance is an investment good as well, is a risk. Nobody can guarantee you that the market delivers growth endlessly, even though we, of course, try to do this, particularly in markets with really high home ownership rates. The central banks, all government policy will be geared towards not popping the housing bubble because it creates so much pain and it makes sure that you're not get re-elected. So that will be fought tooth and nail. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. There's that old saying, no one ever got fired for contracting IBM, and no politician ever lost office by making house prices increase.
Yeah, and it's as simple as that. If 2/3 of the population, that's roughly the Australian figure, is living in a house that they own, well, that's the important figure. Who cares about the rest?
Yeah. All right. So on the future of work, then, if we grasp back on that topic, there's one more thing that I've seen you talking about, which I wanted to hear from you on. We've heard from previous guests, as I mentioned before, but I want your take on this as well. I want to sort of aggregate some of these takes from the demographics community through yourself. We've looked at performance psychology and the like as well. Body language experts on this topic. If you look at the conversation around the nature of human to human work, or what you and I are doing right now, which is having a virtual conversation across the planet, me in your continent of birth and you in my continent of birth. So we've swapped over, and I believe you're a parent. The grandparents naturally don't get too much exposure then to the little one, which I'm sure they've given you trouble for. There are more and more of us in the world doing this, the expat families.
Yeah.
And a part of that, some of them are working in person, some of them are working hybrid, some working remote, some people are working locally in their country of origin and doing this, all sorts of bits and bobs with the nature of hybrid work. How has that debate sort of progressed over your time looking at this topic? And where are some of the key sort of myths around hybrid work that you see that you like to debunk when you're talking to your clients about it?
The stock standard discussion that I find a bit too simplistic is the evil bosses want the workers back in the office so that they can crack the whip, and the lazy workers want to stay at home in their tracksuit pants and not do any work. That's simplistic. And I'm always saying, and we're seeing this very much in the settlement patterns in Australia, in the US as well, is that during the pandemic, everybody, or heaps of knowledge workers that could work from home were forced to work from home, at least sometimes. So that means they stayed there, and then they realized, wait a second, I'm still paying a premium to live close to my office tower that I'm not going to anymore. So how about I move to the urban fringe? How about I move to a bit more of a regional town where the housing is more affordable, and I then work mostly remotely, but I travel into the office, I commute into the office once or twice a week. And then people were willing to take a longer commute onto themselves, because in their head they're somehow calculating that if I only go half the time, my commute can be twice as long. And in Australia, we see a magical 2-hour commuting radius that is drawn around cities. Growth is happening within this 2-hour radius, not outside of that. That will kind of play itself out. In a sense, we open up the areas that people are willing to move to, but that very much takes the hybrid approach into reality. Yes, there are remote workers, but the remote work will continue to be a bit of a niche phenomenon. The hybrid model will be by far the norm. That then leaves the discussion, well, should you go to the office 1 day per week? Should you go 4 days? Maybe I can force my staff back 5 days a week. And I wrote a column, a bit tongue-in-cheek, putting myself into the shoes of a very cynical boss who wants all of their staff back into the office. And they usually have 3 arguments that they make. The first say productivity is higher in the office. And then they say the team culture is better when we're in the office. The sense of loyalty to the organization, to your fellow staff members. And then they say learning, education, training is better when you're in the office. So if we unpack those, we'll start with productivity. No proof whatsoever that you're more productive in the office, period. Nada. Absolutely nothing. Measuring productivity is an absolute nightmare because it is so difficult to untangle with the general macro environment that there's in. If, as a boss, you had a measurement for your particular industry, that's cool, but show me the numbers. I doubt it very much. The best proxy that we have is we know that people that work from home work longer hours. So that must count for something. It's not a perfect measure for productivity, but it at least suggests that you might even be doing more productive work at home. So I don't let the productivity argument fly, to be honest. The other issue is about loyalty and loyalty to the organization. And read research that absolutely blew me away when I first saw it. Your sense of loyalty, your sense of belonging in the organization is the same whether you go to the office 1 day per week or 5 days per week. I couldn't believe it because it's such a big difference. But then I remembered we spoke about my futsal days earlier. That I played futsal for many years. Once a week I saw those guys and I considered them my dear close friends. Then I figured, wait a second, that is probably a reasonably good metaphor, good comparison. So for a team social cohesion, 1 day per week, call it 2 days if you really want to make sure, is enough. But the most important reason to go to force your staff into the office at least partially has to do with training and education. I'm making up those numbers now, but if you imagine your stereotypical 22-year-old grad, they'll go to the office and they'll have a buddy assigned to them. They'll sit in an open space office every day, a couple of new people next to them. They'll ask many questions to people. They'll hear many random stories. Maybe they ask 50 questions per day, whatever it is. If they are working from home, they'll still ask questions because they'll have a buddy assigned to them. They'll have a manager, they'll have a boss, they'll talk to them occasionally. But let's say they ask half as many questions. And they'll definitely hear heaps fewer war stories from the older workers that have all those lessons hidden in them.
Maybe some of those are good not to hear.
That's right. That's right. But it is still organizational knowledge that is not being passed on. And that means, and that is really bad news for all middle managers, you need to purposefully create the kind of incidental learning that usually occurs. That means you need to create more regular training days. You need to make sure that the super nerd in the team teaches all the younger staff once a month, an Excel 101 or whatever your organization needs. There, you need to create those things purposefully. And you need to probably align when all those people go into the office so that those 2 days that you all spend in the office, actually everybody is doing the same days. It's not half as useful if people are split across the whole week willy-nilly. So you want to coordinate this much more. Thank God there's plenty of software, calendar management stuff that allows you to do this. But middle managers, sorry to tell you, it is going to be more annoying to manage that. And on top of that, so once you, as a boss, you kind of aligned those three things: productivity, loyalty, and training. Then you also need to have a very honest look at yourself. It's not an easy task, and say, are those three arguments really why I want people back in the office? Or is it more of a power thing? Is it something that I figured, hey, I worked 30 years really hard to get to the top of the food chain, and now I'm just sitting by myself in the office? Stupid, I hate it. Is it that? Is it something that maybe you just, from a personality perspective, you don't like working from home, and you then force your dislike of working from home on the rest of your staff? These are difficult questions that you need to sort out with yourself as a boss, and then we can think about working from home in a more nuanced way. And so in this debate, lazy workers, evil bosses, I don't take the side of either. I take the side of work. And if you think about the big, huge impact that AI has on the world of work, AI will not make jobs obsolete. Absolutely not. AI will, however, speed up and probably make obsolete quite a few tasks that exist. And if you honestly look at your probably last 2 or 3 work days, you probably did 72 different tasks. Whatever it is, it's some sort of number. You do heaps of tasks. And you wouldn't be all that depressed, sad if a friendly robot or an AI took over 12, 13, 20 of those tasks. The bad news is, however, that, and this is the case for knowledge workers in particular, if AI sped up 20% of your tasks, you wouldn't leave the office at 3 p.m. Because, to misquote Jurassic Park, work finds a way to fill your day.
Yeah,
And
nature abhors a vacuum.
exactly, it eats. That's absolutely right. It eats that up. But what your day will look like is vastly different in the AI future, because the tasks that are being gobbled up, they are technical, repetitive. This is when you move boxes in a PowerPoint, when you program, when you do something in Excel, when replying to emails might be faster. All of those things that get sped up. What AI will not touch at scale, anytime soon at least, is interpersonal work, is interpersonal interpretation of data, conversations with other humans. That will be very much, that'll take up a bigger share of your day, those interpersonal tasks. That means AI, in a very, very counterintuitive notion, will make the world of work more human, more interpersonal. That's quite nice. And it also is an answer to all those people that have billions of dollars invested into the big fat office towers in the CBDs, that are wondering whether they should just board them up and let nature take over. No, the CBDs will be just fine, but not right now and not in the immediate future. In the long term, the CBDs will be fine, because ideally we'd split our work weeks in terms of going to the office and working from home into 2. We do the interpersonal tasks in the office. We do the quiet thinking, repetitive tasks that are still with us, and we do those at home. And again, it needs a bit of alignment. Middle management plays a role here to make sure that we align all those people that benefit from working together, that they come to the office at the same time. And and it will not be that extreme, but if you imagined a CBD where every organization acts this way, it would make sure that all the offices would look differently. We would completely let go of hot desks, of cubicles. Hopefully we let go a decade ago anyways. And it is a much more communal, even rowdy, raucous CBD, where people go to meet with other people. Lots more whiteboards, interactive screens. People would hang out much more in cafes because they meet other potential clients, old colleagues, and so forth. It'd be a wonderful CBD, a CBD that is actually more attractive than the 2019 pre-pandemic CBD. The extreme narrative that I'm describing here is, of course, a bit of a pipe dream, but we are moving into that direction. That's the direction it's working, and that's a better future. And it's up for organizations to decide, hey, how much can we steer our direction towards that? That would be better. And that's when we side with the nature of work, what work wants, rather than what workers want, or what bosses want. That is best for work, and we always talk about earning the commute now. That would earn the commute, because you actually do something in the office that is best done in person. And that would be a cool, wonderful world of work, I would argue.
Yeah, and what you're saying there around like how a city then, a city center, CBD, which stands for Central Business District for those Americans in the audience, downtown, what you guys might call downtown, or for Londoners, the square mile, plus usually also Canary Wharf falls into that category. So cities, CBDs, they can get a bad rap, especially from the urban designers and lots of other people on this vacuous, empty, massive blocks of steel and concrete and glass, right? But then there's the argument around the city being a space of culture, right? Of, you say, going to London's West End, of going, to I'm not sure what the equivalent is in New York. Sorry, New York friends. But going to those cultural hubs like in these major cities. Melbourne's famous for this. I believe you're based out of Melbourne, right?
Yeah, I'm in Melbourne.
Yeah. So, Melbourne, one of the world's most livable cities. Culture side is a big part of that. You've got the MCG just outside of the city. You have just to the east of the city as well, you have like Fitzroy and these sorts of places, Collingwood, these trendy hipster sorts of places. How then, like, that seems quite well aligned what you're saying with cities being reimagined back to perhaps their more adaptive state as, say, a center of culture, a meeting place of people to exchange ideas and entertain one another and do that magic that makes us human, say.
Yeah. Also, yeah. So when we think about the changing nature of cities, and this is when we move into big picture demographic data as well, the city is, of course, the centralized. Lots of functions in a city need to be centralized. This is, you throw all your arts, all your sporting structures, your big, basketball stadiums, whatever it is, in the center of town. That makes perfect sense. And so people from all over town, they go into the CBD to do those very special events. And of course, lots of people live in near the CBD. They're usually people before the family formation stage of the life cycle. So people under the age of 40 almost exclusively dominate the inner suburbs. And once they have families, they move to suburbia, they move to the urban fringes of the cities. That is the case in most Western cities, more or less. To speak. And at the moment, over the last decade, when all of the millennials were before the family formation stage, that was another heyday for the city center, because the biggest generation that ever lived, the millennials, in at least in the US and in because it's a migrant nation in Canada, the US, New Zealand, Australia, there was very much the largest generation that ever lived, the millennials. They all were in the renting stage of the life cycle, in the pre-family stage. They wanted to live in the inner city. So that meant the city was super vibrant, lots of activities. And now, even without the pandemic, with all these things from working from home that we discussed, we would have seen a bit of a lull in the inner city, because millennials become suburbanites. They move away. And the next cohort that moves into the CBD for now is smaller. So there was always going to be a bit of a lag of activity there. Migration nations and cities that grow, they fill this up because they get population growth from the rest of the country. Germany, for example, where I'm from, is a stagnant population on a national level, but my hometown of Munich is growing rapidly. So all the young people go to Munich and Berlin largely in Germany. And so those areas are just doing fine because they get enough young lifeblood to keep those inner city areas nice and active. Other cities don't have that now. They have a lag. And that creates demographic dynamics. And when we look at global population data, we see that this trend will overall continue, because we'll see peak humanity in the 2060s. We will not grow bigger than we are in about 40 years' time. So if you are 40, you'll probably see peak humanity if you're 40 and under. which I find quite astonishing as a 40-year-old. So that's just a nice bit of trivia. But that is only the human population, the absolute human population. If you look at people that we call of migration age, those young active people, 18 to 39 years of age, they'll start stagnating on a human or on a global level in about 10 years. So we're running out of young people very, very soon. And that means that the standard forces that created all those wonderful new innovations, that's a smaller cohort now. That's difficult. And also, fewer young people means that capital will change. Because if you think about this, the older you get, the less you are supposed to invest into risky stuff. You are supposed to invest into boring, stable stuff. As we as a world get older, who is investing into risky stuff? Yes, we live a bit longer and there is more appetite. The baby boomers that are growing old now, they are more willing to take risks in their investment, even in old age, but they are still de-risking their portfolios. So ultimately, we need to think about where is innovation coming from in the future. So I'm one of the people that very much hopes that AI can make us more productive, because demographically speaking, we are running out of the hyper-productive workers very soon, globally speaking. So, if we get a bit of a leg up from friendly computers, I'm all for it.
Let me then ask you about something that came up for me recently, which I found quite interesting. Because when we talk about this inverted population pyramid, aging population, these sorts of things around the world, oftentimes people will not just talk about what you said just now around, okay, well, the nature of investment and the financial sector will shift. But we've also got like the use of space will shift, going back to our conversation around cities, right? So, it may be, less likely to see an 80-year-old out in the middle of Soho, at 3 o'clock in the morning on a Wednesday night or a Friday night or something like that, as you would an 18-year-old or a 22-year-old or something, right? So naturally your behaviors differ, your accessibility requirements change, and the nature of housing changes. Now, one of the saddest functions I think of the West is the way that we sort of segregate like older members of our community into aged care and things like that. Naturally, the design of our cities is kind of structured in that way. But by virtue, I've heard, in the real estate sector, a lot of conversations around, well, we've got to build X amount of aged care facilities in this period of time in order to meet the demand that's going to come from this, not just aging population, but population that's also living longer. So really pushing that average up in two ways. Now, what intrigues me is, because to your point, then the younger cohorts are coming through, which have fewer numbers, right? We reached the peak in the 2060s, which says to me that, okay, it might not be our problem. You and I are going to be old and our consciousness downloaded to a computer by this time. But at some point, we're going to end up with an oversupply of aged care housing, or aged housing in whichever way you want to frame it, designed for today's style of communities, right? With today's design considerations. There's going to be a massive oversupply of that unless there's some kind of adaptive element applied to that. Some sort of, okay, well, this can be reused when it's no longer needed in 30 or 40 years' time to this type of application or that type of application. Or maybe we're rethinking urban design entirely to account for the fact that 90-year-olds no longer go into a house, miles away from town. Now they're integrated with the rest of town and all those sorts of things. Like, has any of this kind of come up for you, and what that could look like?
Plenty of issues. So remember that, and I have the Australian figures in mind, but very much the same trend is true for the whole Western world. If we talk about places like Italy or Greece, they are decades ahead. So in Australia, for example, we're doubling the population 85 plus in 12 years, from 500,000 to 1 million people. 85 is a lovely statistical age to use, because in the Western world, half of us doesn't make it to 85. The remaining half that makes it past 85, half of that cohort needs care. That's huge. So that's massive. And when we think about old people, when we talk about aged care facilities, they only get pushed in there if it's absolutely needed, if the family house becomes a physical hazard to manage. Usually in their 70s, everything hurts, all joints hurts and whatever, but you're still mobile, you're still with it, so to speak. So all is well. But at some stage, all your functions decline, and what do you do in order to prolong your independence? Because here people all over, they say stuff like, I want to be carried out of my family house. That seems to be the main goal in life. Yeah? That might
Just
be
not too
considered the
young. Not when you're 40.
No, absolutely, because you don't become a homeowner until you're 40. And so
True.
so the whole idea is you really obsess about staying, living independently in your own house. And, being carried out is, of course, the ultimate downsizing into the little box. But more than anything, this is a result of this very individualistically minded baby boomer cohort that is in 10 years' time reaching the 85 plus care level cohort. They will want to live independently. That is the name of the game. So we need to rethink the way retirement looks like. If you think about just the physical look of a 75-year-old today and 30 years ago, they're unrecognizable. People 30 years ago at 75 looked like old ancient people. These are hip 75-year-olds.
So Wimbledon finished yesterday. That will date this podcast. I know it's a cardinal rule not to do. But Wimbledon finished yesterday, and they showed Brad Pitt was 3 years older than the combined age of the two competitors in the male singles final, right? And that made him, I think, something like, is he 59 or 69 or something like that? It's got to be 50. It can't be 69. And he looks younger than me. Yeah. So I take your point. I definitely take your point.
We age differently. We stay active and fitter for longer. We dress differently in old age, and we view ourselves differently. We do not give ourselves permission to be old. In retirement living, that retirement living villages is a thing. This is before aged care. This is when you have aged communities. There might be a bit of medical service on hand as well, but it's more independent living. These communities they fix quite a few problems, because you want to remember that in most couples, we're talking about straight couples here, the man is 3 years older than the wife and has 3 years longer 3 years shorter life expectancy. So there's a 6-year gap where the woman is likely, statistically speaking, to be a widow. Loneliness in old age is an outrageous pandemic, so to speak. And we know that if you live in your family house in a car-dependent suburb, you're all but guaranteed to be miserable in 10 years' time if you're 75 today. It is brutal. So we can map this across cities. We can map human mental despair in old age. And that's brutal. And in one way, the goal still remains to live in those, in the independent. This is my family house. I know my way around here, but that's painful. And from a mental health perspective, those retirement living facilities have something going for them, because it makes sure that you are not there alone. You have a community aspect to it. So I see that as a potential solution. I'm seeing probably more and more very proactive things emerge in baby boomers getting older. Something like it's not quite as chaotic as shared living in your university days, but co-housing will be a thing where you have 2, 3, 4 couples buying a massive property and essentially providing support mentally to each other, and then you'll be fine if just bit by bit a partner or two die off. And if somebody gets has care needs, you can, if you're rich enough, you can buy care into this arrangement. These are things that will be done more and more, and we'll do them at scale. We do them globally. So here's free financial advice. What do I care? Um, anything that touches that sector that allows people to live independently for longer will make a big buck, and it is also providing necessary relief on society, because we just don't have, even in a migration nation like Australia, we just don't have enough workers to look after our old cohort in 10 years' time. So any technological advantage that makes sure that you live independently without needing care, this can be built environment things, or technological, wearable technology, that goes a long way in making a country operate better. Think about simple stuff like an Apple Watch that surely will be better and more complex in 10 years' time. If you throw one of those Apple Watches onto an elderly user, a fall gets detected. Period. It's quite simplistic, whatever it is. And so you know that this is the biggest risk that you might be seeing with your dad, your grandma, whatever it is. And you go, cool, so you can live a bit longer independently. Even if this is only half a year for that particular person, if you throw this at a national level, you win massively for an investment of whatever $700. I have no idea what an Apple Watch costs. $1,000. It's that.
I got my Garmin watch with Qantas points, so so I don't know how much they were.
Whatever it is. But so this is the kind of technology that we're talking about that has a real impact on a population level. Yes, you do. It's a bit of a tech game for the individuals, but that's with us. That'll be with us wherever we go. And yep, if you play in this field, you'll have a marvelous decade ahead.
So let me test you on this thought then, right? Because I'm with you, and you know I'm. As you know, I say this a lot on this podcast. I guess it just comes up naturally in some ways that, you know, myself and many other people I've come across in my travels are hyper extroverted. I would probably classify my grandmother this way as well, right? She had the misfortune of my grandfather, her husband, serving in Hiroshima in the aftermath of the bomb. And he died with cancer riddled all through his body just as he retired. I think he was about 60 or something like that from memory. I was about a year old. So she spent my life, my grandmother has spent as a widow. So much more than that 6-year gap you're referring to. She's maybe an outlier there. And the tough thing is that, you know, she likes being around people. She loves being around people. And so a lot of these interventions you're talking about would be great. You know, she said to my parents the other day, which broke my heart because I'd love the privilege and opportunity to be able to do this. She said to my parents, "Oh, you know, I'd love to go and visit Luke and Hannah for a few weeks over in London." You know, but that can't happen. But things that, because you know she just can't fly. She's now in her 90s, but things that probably can happen when it comes to this tech, when it comes to solving some of these challenges, you know, one that you didn't touch on that has maybe ethical challenges, perhaps, if you frame it in this way, is things like virtual and augmented reality, higher fidelity interactions that compete with what you and I are doing right now, right? I wonder if that has a role to play, and if that kind of then merges into a little bit of a dystopian sort of image of interpersonal interactions then being virtual more so than real. And you know, it's a bit of a box to unpack, but what do you intuit when you hear that?
I'm not all that panicked about it, to be honest, especially not in the short term. So people take the technologies that they're comfortable with into old age. I see that I'm only 40, if you will, and I find myself more and more reluctant if there's yet another social media platform or whatever to fully embrace it, and that only gets more intense, the tech reluctancy if you get old. So the tech people, the core that would be really embracing virtual reality, you know, holograms, whatever it is, in old age, that would be the people that grow up with that being normal. So that is an issue of you and I, we are much too old to think that that's normal. You know, if you have teens when that's coming up now, let's say in 10 years' time, the teens, so the 8-year-olds of today, they'll probably think that that's to be normal. That's still a fair bit out, if it comes at all. And overall, so in forecasting, there's a popular mistake that we make is that we look at a single piece of technology and then we think that this is completely changing the world, and it is not. If you think about the internet, which really was clearly a big cut in we work differently, lots of things work differently. Overall, the human life now, compared to maybe 30 years ago when the internet was not a thing for the masses, a couple of super computer nerds had the internet, but not at scale. World in 1993 looked much the same than it does now. It's not that different. Yes, there were no mobile phones. Oh man, bricks, but only few people had them. But overall, people went to work, had relationships, followed sports. Yes, a couple of details changed. We spent less time outside, probably as kids and so forth. But overall, it's not that shockingly different. And even if you go back 100 years, it's not that different. And you can play this game on, and you see you add technologies bit by bit on there. That's like probably won't be making that much of a difference. And we tend to go back to the importance of human face-to-face interaction. We started with this working from home discussion. And one of the reasons is why this is so important that we say we need to come back to the office in some degree is because we have a deep understanding that we do need to connect with one another. There's a different connection when you talk to somebody face to face than you do online. To a certain degree, of course, this online thing also humanized your workers because you're seeing beyond the worker. As simplistic as it sounds, but by just looking into people's studies and bedrooms, you realize they're actually a human rather than just the worker bee in the suit that you see every day. And that was nice. And ideally, we have both of those things. We understand that people play across a spectrum. And yeah, I'm not too fast. I'm always in favor of embracing technology. And I very much realize that any new technology at the start will be misused, or not misused, but will be overused and used in a wrong way. We are now making heaps of mistakes with something like social media, 15-year-old technology. That's to be expected. We'll iron this out. Lots of the privacy concerns that we have with social media platforms, with centrally owned data and so forth, that is being fixed literally right now as we speak with the Fediverse and with all those alternative technology approaches towards social media. We're fixing this. Only 15 years after the initial social media revolution. That is pretty quick. In the meantime, we screw up. In the meantime, we unleash mental health monsters like Instagram on people. It's a nightmare. It shouldn't exist. Kill it tomorrow. Kill it today, Instagram. It's doing no good whatsoever. Kill it. Only negative consequences. Shouldn't exist, period. It's like smoking. I'm quite radical about this, even though I am, of course, on Instagram. But we learn this bit by bit, and we'll adjust, and we will educate people, young people as well. So when we have all this chat about old people get hooked on technology, they can't separate the real from the fake, and our young folks, they will never ever talk to people in 3D or well in person. I don't buy it. I don't see it. I see ultimately that the human desire to be a master of your own life wins out, and we become more knowledgeable about how certain technologies impact us, and ultimately we'll fix it. I do really believe in the good and in the knowledgeable end of human civilization, because we're seeing what doesn't work now. We're seeing fake news, we're seeing spread, we're seeing bots discussing nonsense. All of this will be somehow fixed in the long run.
Well, Simon, that was very philosophical and therefore a fantastic way to put a punctuation mark on this episode, I think. So, did you have any final thoughts, or were you happy leaving it there?
Plenty of very broad and fun discussion topics here. I massively enjoyed the chat.
Yes, me too. It's I've had a couple of these where I think to myself, this could have easily turned into a 4 hour conversation. So what that means is that I'm going to volunteer you for a future episode, not too far into the distant
Anytime.
future. Beautiful. Thank you, Simon.
It's been a pleasure.